session. I hope some of you have got better weather than we've got here up in Stockport today with the snow, so I'm sure many of you have also got it worse and some better, so hope you're all keeping well. Can I just do a little bit of housekeeping before we start? Obviously, this session is going to go streamed onto YouTube as well, just so that people are aware of that. Can I ask people to put their microphones on mute if I think that I was just muted there by Lisa. See, look at that. Isn't that awful what she wants to do to me? I don't know. So what I was just saying, if you could put your microphones on mute, and if you can make sure you can keep it on mute until it comes to a point that you might want to ask a question, that would be really helpful just for feedback. Just for sound.
Can you hear me, Jenny?
Who was that?
Robin. It's Robin.
Hi, Robin. You okay?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
I can. I can hear and see you. Fine. Wonderful.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So what we'll be doing is, in a second, I'm going to hand over to Fiona, and she's here in a second. Fiona's going to do a short talk. There's no slides, because we deliberately want this to be a really interactive and relaxed session, a real Q&A, a real chance for you to ask the questions that you want to do. So Fiona will talk for a few minutes, and then we'll open up to questions. I've had some questions sent to me in advance. So I will pick some of those first, and we'll go for those. But then, as I'm sure many of you are, if you want to pop any questions that you've got in the chat function, myself, Lisa, will keep an eye on those as we're going through. So please pop them in there, and I will come to as many of those questions as I can as the session unfolds. We're probably looking to finish about 3:15, but we'll see how we get on, and we can always go a little bit longer if we need to. So, like I say, really delighted to have Fiona McGregor with us today from the Regulator of Social Housing. It's fantastic that Fiona's joining us. It's a real opportunity for all of us as Tpas members to ask some questions to Fiona direct. And I do want this to be a really useful session for us all. And I know Fiona's looking forward to getting as much out of it and hearing what the questions that you've got to ask, as well as you're looking forward to some of the answers. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Fiona. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks very much. And hiya to everybody. And thanks so much for asking me. I'm really pleased to be here. Like Jenny, I was going to say, I hope everybody's kind of surviving whatever weather conditions you're facing at the minute, because it does seem pretty grim in various bits of the country, watching the news. I was going to just start, as Jenny said, by maybe just talking a wee bit through the white paper and what it means by way of consumer regulation. I'll try not to spend too much time on that, because I think the key today is to have that kind of conversation and you'll get to the Q&A and just basically hear what you've got to say, what your thoughts are. But a couple of things by way of sort of just introductory remarks. And actually, one of the things I'm really acutely conscious of is we use an awful lot of jargon in housing and in the white paper and other things. So if and I'm not very good at it because I'm not necessarily a regulator through and through, but if we use jargon that you just think, I don't even know what that means, just interrupt me and ask me, and hopefully I'll know the answer. Let me just take you through a wee bit by way of those introductions. I think the first thing to say is, I mean, you've all seen the themes of the white paper, sort of chapter headings around building safety, around transparency, accountability to tenants, respect, which is the chapter that focuses on consumer regulation, but our stuff kind of runs a bit throughout it. There are the themes that are contained in those chapter headings, I think, and we've had this feedback, we've heard this from other people, I hope reflect a bit of that kind of golden thread of the conversations that ministers were having at round tables in the immediate sort of post the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire, which kind of is the thing that was the trigger, I think, for all of this. Various tenants have told us, for the most part, they recognise the themes and feel that, there's at least some evidence there that the things that they were saying at those roundtables have been listened to. And I think the other thing to say about the themes and the sort of chapter headings is, I would certainly say this, and I think others might agree, is they do seem to be, they're about the basics, they're about the fundamentals, they're about running a good housing service for tenants. And so, you know, there's nothing in there that looks like rocket science. They are about getting the sort of basic fundamentals of a good service right. And then quite a lot of the white paper, but not all of it, talks about our role as a consumer regulator in a change into becoming a more proactive consumer regulator, more proactive regime, and kind of ensuring that those themes are being delivered and that tenants are getting good and, I hope, improving services. So we're really pleased. We were really pleased to see the white paper finally see the light of day, apart from anything else. But for me, I hope what it signals is a kind of a rebalancing, if you like, of you know, where the focus needs to be between consumer regulation and economic regulation, and it's both of them. They go together. I think there had been a pendulum swing for whatever reason, you know, about 10 years ago or so, when our consumer regulation role, which it remains for now, became reactive, and the serious detriment test was introduced before we could take enforcement action. And I think everybody felt that swung the pendulum just too far to one end. And, you know, if nothing else, that's been pretty hard to explain to people over the years. My hope is that this isn't a kind of, you don't swing the pendulum back and forward between the two extreme ends, you know, again and again. This is about getting it into a good balance in the middle. And I think that's because, you know, economic regulation, which we, as we call it, the bit that we do proactively at the minute, which covers governance, and in my book, governance is just quite a fancy term for running your organisation well, making sure that you're kind of doing things properly, and viability is the other bit of the economic side of things. That and consumer they're just two sides of the same coin. So if you're not well run as an organisation, you're unlikely to be delivering good services well to your tenants. And if you're not delivering good services to your tenants, you're unlikely to be terribly well run. So they are kind of, you know, they are just genuinely, I think, two sides of the same coin. And then the other thing I'd say just about the white paper, more generally, and then I'll get into a couple of specifics, is I acknowledge, I completely understand that some people argued for and made the case to have a new regulator, a new consumer regulator, and not to give it to us. And I think there are valid arguments both ways. We're pleased to have got it, because I think trying to ensure that you make sure that those links are made between what happens on the consumer side and the sort of economic governance, running an organisation well, I think that's helpful. And hopefully it helps a wee bit in terms of eliminating confusion if you've got lots and lots of different regulators all doing different things. But folk will have different views, and you know, obviously that's entirely fine. Just a couple of points about sort of a little bit about how this will be taken forward, and in particular about timescales. So again, if for those of you who've had a chance to read the white paper, there's quite a few of the things that it talks about in there that will need legislation. You need legislation to remove the serious detriment test. You need legislation to change some of our role and our objectives. You know, there's various bits. And we'll have to do things around kind of consultation on what the government directs us on, and then consultation on our consumer standards. And there isn't, so far, we don't have a confirmed legislative slot. So all of this will take a bit of time, and I can't give you a definitive timescale at the minute because we don't have legislative slot. But I think the two kind of important bits of that is we want to really use that time to very good effect, hopefully, to kind of have conversations like this on an ongoing basis to get people's views and help shape what that new proactive consumer regulation regime looks like, what the standards need to look like, all of those things. So hopefully time will be helpful in that regard. And then the other thing, and apologies if loads of you've heard me say this tons of times before, but one of the things we say to registered providers, to landlords, is if you think there are things that you need to be sorting now and getting better at, you don't need to wait for legislation. You don't need to wait for a new regime to be in place. Just get, talk to your tenants, find out what they want and need, and get on with it if there are things that you could improve now. So hopefully time will be useful and not just drag on and on and on. And a couple other bits. Again, one of the reasons I think time could be helpful to us is we want to get this right in the round, if you like. It's kind of, it has to be a kind of framework that works. So the thing we regulate against is that our standards. So we'll have to make sure that we get the consumer standards, any changes to the consumer standards, we get those right and we can regulate against them and they deliver the things that are useful and tenants want. And then anything else that is part of the kind of infrastructure that supports that, like tenant satisfaction measures or KPIs in old language, or the inspection regime or any of those things, how you implement it is all about making sure that landlords are meeting the consumer standards. And frankly, the first place to start is landlords should be making sure for themselves that they're meeting the consumer standards. In an ideal world, you get a assurance that they are, and you kind of check that assurance in a range of different ways. But landlords should be meeting the consumer standards, providing a good service. And in an ideal world, we're here a bit more as a kind of backstop, either when things are going wrong, or to try and do that kind of general levelling up across the sector. And I think that levelling up bit is important. I think there is a kind of, making sure in due course we can identify outliers. We can now go and ask, or we will be able to go and ask questions to check where people are at and what they're doing and how well they're doing it. And where there are people who are not doing it terribly well, it's about improving things across the board, across all organisations for tenants. I think that's probably just about all I was going to say by way of kind of introductory remarks. Just a kind of a little bit of an overview of what I think the white paper is either trying to do or should be trying to do, and the fact that as we move to implement this, we will want to kind of make sure that we're talking to people as we go along, getting views and input and shaping things in a way that's effective for you. I've said a few times to certainly to my team, but also elsewhere, I think there's sort of three tests of whether or not we've been successful. The first thing is, the first and the most important test is, can tenants, over time, can tenants see a difference? Are you getting a better service on average from all landlords without having to come to us or go anywhere else to complain about it? So, has it improved things for you? That's test number one. That's really important. The second test is actually, can landlords meet the consumer standards, which isn't to say we want to make them too soft or that they shouldn't be stretching or challenging. But if we come up with a set of standards or a kind of means of implementing them that actually are just undoable, then again, we've failed. You can't kind of hold people to a bar that's just impossible to meet. And then the third test, which probably most people care about much less than I do, but I do care about this, is whatever we come up with has to be, this isn't a proper word, but it has to be regulatable. We need to be able to test it and be able to take action against it. So we need to come up with a set of standards that we can regulate for real. So those will be my tests, and in however many months or years' time, it would be really good to kind of see if those tests are being met and continue to be met. I can see a wee question popping up, and one of the things I should have been really clear about is this. The consumer standards now, actually, because we do have consumer standards, but we regulate them on a reactive basis. The consumer standards now apply to local authorities as well as to housing associations in old language. They apply to all registered providers and the new regime will apply to all registered providers, including local authorities. So there's a wee bit of a kind of nuance there where we don't, what I said right at the start about economic regulation, because we don't have an economic regulation role for local authorities, but the consumer bit does apply. That's a lot of, so I'll stop and take questions.
Okay, thank you, Fiona, for that introduction and kind of overview. And yes, and I'm pleased to see questions are coming into the chat box thick and fast. So I just encourage everybody to do that and to pop them in here. So like I said before, what I'll do is I'll go to some of the questions we've had submitted from people in advance, if that's okay, and then I'll come to some of those over on the chat box. So let's just, I mean, I think you'll have touched on some of this, but if we can kind of answer this question. It's from Nigel from Lewisham Homes. What role does Fiona envisage for residents in shaping this new approach to consumer protection? And how do you envisage the regulator will hear the residents' voice on an ongoing basis? So kind of how are residents would be involved in shaping the new approach and hearing residents' voice on an ongoing basis?
Okay, so let me start a bit with the shaping. I mean, one of the things that I hope people possibly have already started to see, but over the course of the next year, you'll see us out and about a lot, talking to tenants, to tenant representative bodies, structured conversations as we develop some of our approach to get that input and make sure that we're hearing basically what matters to you, and how we can design a regime that addresses, some of the issues that matter to you. So we already have some things that we've been doing for years, so we'll use them, but we'll build on them. So we have a sounding board at the minute that Jenny from Tpas and other tenant representative bodies sit on. We also separately meet the tenant representative bodies on it was a quarterly basis. We're up in the frequency of that since the white paper's been published. So the conduit channels we'll use. We will, through bodies such as Tpas and others, organise meetings with wider groups of tenants, with the Fed, some of the people they talk to, together with tenants groups, as many routes in as we can get in terms of the shaping. And actually, we're really conscious that you need to try and make sure you get a really good balance of voices being heard, because one of the criticisms that often is, I think, about engagement, to use a kind of a fancy word for it, is that it's the same people. And a bit of what I've just said is a bit of it's the same people. It's people we already talk to. We want to also try and find ways to kind of reach out to slightly harder to reach. Somebody's described it to me as the sort of silent majority, people who don't always put themselves forward or don't always kind of put their hand up to come and talk. And we're going to speak to some specialist consultants to try and help us with that. So we'll use as many channels as we can in a reasonably structured way, to be out and about over the next months, years, in shaping the new framework. And then in terms of the ongoing voice, I don't envisage that we will let go of some of the things that we already do, like the quarterly meetings with the tenant representative bodies. We'll take a view on what we do with the sounding board going forward, but there's also the advisory panel that the white paper signals that we'll set up, and that will have tenant bodies and indeed some individual tenants. I've got no doubt that's the kind of ongoing bit, if you like, that we'll want to make sure that we're hearing from you. That's all the kind of strategic stuff. One of the things, and I would really emphasize that this is part of an overall framework, but one of the things that the white paper makes clear is that we will introduce an inspection regime, and we'll carry out inspections once every 4 years of landlords with over 1,000 homes, in the way that we do, and possibly at the same time as and linked to, we currently do in-depth assessments on the economic side of providers. We'll do that. But that's not just about going and talking to the landlords and taking at face value whatever they tell us. We will want to test that. We will want to be able to speak to tenants and get their views and their input and check whether some of the things that the landlord is telling us, is matched by, people's kind of real experience on the ground of being a tenant for that provider. And again, that's something that, that's not the strategic, that's the specific to the provider themselves. That's something that will carry on once we implement the regime and it's been shaped. That will carry on as part of their, how we're carrying it out, if you like.
That's really helpful, because I mean that links to a question that Sharon Cole from South Derbyshire had sent in around kind of what will the landlord inspection format look like, and you've touched on that, but sort of the proposed timetables, if you could kind of recap that a bit, and an interesting question: what organisations will it start with? Are you going to give us an insider tip here on today?
So Jenny, Sharon, I can't give you kind of hard and fast timetables at the minute, because it's so much of it is contingent on legislation, and that law isn't secured yet, as I say. So the kind of the starting point for the full rollout, I genuinely don't know at the moment, but there's lots and lots of steps on the way. And one of the things we'll want to do as we kind of design the new framework is pilot and test some of the approaches. So, if we're talking specifically at the minute about inspections, once we've kind of got a prototype design, if you like, we'll want to kind of test that with a few providers, get some feedback, see how that's working, adapt it, modify it, ready for full implementation at the point at which we're ready for full implementation. In terms of who will go first, well, obviously, I certainly couldn't name any names right now, but one of the things we do with our in-depth assessment programme is we take, it's a combination of just programmed, because you need to get through everyone, but risk-based. And so if we think there's anyone that we're particularly worried about on the consumer regulation side, and if we are, we'll get in there and do something really early on anyway. But we'll take account of, what we're hearing. If somebody looks like they're an outlier on tenant satisfaction measures, for example, which I'd like to come back to, but if they look like they're an outlier, or we're getting lots and lots of referrals, or the housing ombudsman is saying that this is an organisation that they're a bit worried about, then you could imagine that we won't want to do all the bad ones up front, assuming there are lots of them, but you'll want to kind of get through them at the fastest possible pace, alongside hopefully some good landlords and good examples as well, because it helps you to kind of test that you're getting the right balance of what good looks like compared to areas where people need to improve.
Really helpful, thank you. A couple of questions really, sort of linked, I suppose, from John Townend at Burnsley Homes. So thanks for these, John. But I think following up, you're obviously bringing in a set of tenant satisfaction measures for all landlords on the things that matter to tenants. So again, if we could just sort of tease out that debate, what's going to need to happen to get us to a set of tenant satisfaction measures that truly do matter to tenants? How will tenants be part of that? How will landlords be part of it? And what do you think is going to be the hub of the issue with the tenant satisfaction measures? Could we try and explore that area?
Yeah. So I mean, Jenny, you know this, you've experienced some of it. You can talk about tenant satisfaction measures, as they've now been termed, for hours, and over the next few months and years we will. So there was some a set of measures kind of set out in the white paper, which were those that had been come up with. Those are what the government had kind of come up with in consultation with some other bodies, but those were the ones that the government wanted us to kind of consult on and think about. So that's our starting point. They're in there. There's about, I think, 23, 24 of them. And it talks about things like, tenant satisfaction, number of complaints, turnaround time on repairs, how you're meeting Are you meeting health and safety on gas, on electric, all of those things? So that's the starting point for the discussion. The 2 things, 2/3 things I think we are really, really interested in, and this will form the basis of quite extensive conversations, I hope, is firstly, do those look like the kinds of things that you're interested in or worried about or affect your life on a day-to-day basis? So, are they even broadly in the right areas? Is a big set of kind of overarching discussions that we want to have, or are there other things that are much more important to you that these wouldn't cover? That's the first thing. And I think in that space, actually, we should also hold on to the fact that there's maybe a wee bit of a difference between what matters to tenants and what you might want information about and what you might want to use to hold your landlord to account for, and what we would use to actually regulate against the standards. We want some of those measures to tell us something about how people are meeting the standards as part of that package in the round in due course. So there's what do people care about? And then there's a whole load of really quite tricky, I think, potentially tricky technical stuff that's really dry, but some people love this, around, well, whatever your measure is, how do you measure it? How do you kind of make sure that everybody's measuring it in a really consistent way? And that talks to all sorts of really potentially quite detailed, this is for landlords, but it does matter, quite detailed descriptions of how you might measure it. And that's important because you want some consistency so that you're getting a bit of an idea of how landlords compare with each other. And is there somebody that looks like they're just nowhere near the kind of the kind of average, if you like, and certainly nowhere near the best. So there's a whole load of stuff that we'll want to talk to people about to make sure that we can kind of get that to the best place possible in due course. And then I think linked to that, and linked actually to what matters, I mean, lots of people have told us that tenant satisfaction measures, KPIs, whatever you want to call them, might not always be the point. And there's always a risk that you alight, whatever set you alight on, then that's what people focus on. And they're not doing what I talked about right at the start about, the key thing is, are you providing good services to your tenants? Are you being a good landlord in the round? And you will know better, landlords should know better how to do that than any set of KPIs is going to tell them. So you want to design a set that doesn't become the only focus, doesn't become a kind of competitive, people think the only thing they need to do is make sure in the top quartile or whatever it is, and nothing else that they should be doing because it's not been measured, it's not been done, kind of thing. So you don't want to drive sort of perverse incentives that people focus on the wrong things, either the wrong things for their business or they just forget about some other bits. So, I mean, I'm talking about this and I'm just not an expert on this, and we've got experts who could talk for hours about this stuff. And it's, in some ways it's really dry, but in other ways it really matters, because at its heart, we work on a kind of co-regulatory basis, and we don't try and sort of just do a tick box, you must do this, and if you can tick those boxes, you've passed the test. We work on a kind of outcome focused basis. So tenant satisfaction measures are one bit of the toolkit. They can be a can opener, but they're not an end in themselves, and they shouldn't be seen as an end in themselves. So that's I'm not even sure if I've answered the question anymore, Jenny, but that's the kinds of things that we want to be talking to people about, is trying to kind of have those discussions in a really kind of rich, informed, useful way, to get to the best, insofar as possible, the best set of measures, tell you something useful.
Well, no, I think that's really helpful. But I think your point of the problem, I think we've all talked about this. The problem with measures can be like you say, people just get fixed on meeting those and don't see the wider picture, or what's important to them on a kind of local basis. And there's a couple of questions I can see floating around about that local perspective, which we'll try and come to in a little while. But so I think what you're saying then is, as a regulator, you're going to be kind of taking two sides of a story. You've got the measures that you'll be looking at, but also you're interested in the stories, the outcomes that go around that, which allows people to have quite, you know, different structures around engagement and tenant work, but you're going to be setting a regulatory system that can cope with that effectively.
That's exactly it, Jenny, completely it. And so the thing I'll come back to again and again during this conversation is the most important thing for us is getting the standards right. Everything else is a tool. Getting the standards right and doing it in the way, I hope we do it in the way that we do now with our standards, and particularly on the economic side of things, which is focusing on high level outcomes, you know, broadly, what are the kinds of outcomes you're trying to achieve? How you do it is up to you in consultation with your tenants and residents, what matters in your area, your geography, your communities. How you do it is for you to decide. It's an overall outcome that is best in all the circumstances that you're dealing with. And we'll try, it's easier said than written down, I think, but we want to try and kind of set out the standards in a way that, you know, allows that to happen, but also allows us to regulate against them if we can see that the outcomes are poor.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Okay, let's just do a couple of quick practical questions. I think one of the early ones I saw in the chat was from Stella, so thank you, Stella. Stella says, I'd just like to ask, who regulates the regulator and who pays for the regulator's services? So let's do a really good practical one and clear some myths up on that one.
Okay, right. So I'll start actually with the who pays for the regulator, because that actually feeds into the who regulates the regulator. So at the minute, and this is reasonably recent, on the economic side of things, most of what our costs are now paid for by providers through fees. And that is in line with Treasury expectations, because so there's a kind of Treasury rule that if you're applying a form of regulation to just about all of those that you regulate, then it gets paid for through fees. Some of our work gets paid for by the government, and that is the stuff that we do that doesn't apply to everybody. So we've got what we call an investigation and enforcement team. If a provider at the minute is non-compliant, the costs of that team are paid for the government. They shouldn't be paid for everybody, because not everybody's subject to it. It's a tax. It's a kind of techie thing, but so most of it's paid for through fees. On the consumer regulation side of things, in due course, and I stress in due course, when it applies to everyone, it is likely that will be paid for through fees as well. And the couple of bits to kind of say when it applies to everyone in due course, as we're going through the setup phase, it should be paid for by government, because it doesn't yet apply to everyone. We've not rolled it out in full. And the work that we do in terms of regulating local authorities, there's a kind of general Treasury principle that one bit of the public sector doesn't pay for another bit of the public sector, because it's just public money going round in a circle. So in due course, it'll be covered by fees. That, in terms of accountability, from our point of view, who are we answerable to? I think since this has always been the case, but particularly true since we introduced fees just over a couple of years ago, that makes us, to an extent, accountable to our providers, which isn't that they can tell us what to do or how to do it, but we should be able to, clarify that we're doing, demonstrate that we're doing a good and an effective job, and secondly, that we're offering good value for money. We're not just empire building, got loads and loads of resources, everybody's sitting around, not very much to do, having a nice cushy life, but somebody else is paying for it, so it's fine. So I would expect to be held to account for that. And then who regulates the regulator? Well, This is a wee bit of history. We've only been a standalone organisation for just over 2 years now. And we did some mapping as we were being set up as a standalone organisation. I have got, I think, personally, and I genuinely mean personally, I've got accountability lines to about 7 different places. So in the first instance, as an organisation, as executives, we're accountable to our board. But probably more than that, I'm accountable to MHCLG, our sponsor department. So I am formally the accounting officer, and I have to have formal accounting officer meetings with MHCLG. But I'm also accountable to Parliament. So as an organisation, if we're messing up, I can be asked to appear in front of the Public Accounts Committee, which is, if it's done in anger, that's not much fun. So that weighs very heavily on me in terms of doing a good job. And also I can be asked to appear before the Select Committee. So there's quite a big, and frankly, from my point of view, reasonably scary, rightly so, scary framework that I think I'm accountable to, as well as all of you, actually. The advisory panel, although it would be advisory, I'd expect you to ask us demanding questions about how good a job we're doing in due course.
Okay, great. I hope that answers that question for you, Stella, and for many others, I'm sure. We all learned something definitely there. I'm going to come to Caritas now. There's no point just hearing just from me all the way through. So Caritas, you've got a question. So if you want to unmute yourself, Caritas, if you want to pop your question to Fiona.
Hi Fiona, I'm Caritas from Bristol City Council. My question is that within the white paper, the new regulations call for a yearly desktop evaluations on the consumer standards. How will you formulate the measures working with tenants and providers to ensure that they actually have real value?
Yeah, so Caritas, and I probably should have said this more clearly at the start, I won't have definitive answers to all of your questions yet, because the whole point, there's a real kind of, I think, ethos in the white paper about landlords listening to their tenants. And I think, it's incumbent on us as the regulator to listen to people before we kind of go absolutely nap on any of these things. We should be, designing this in consultation with others. But there are a range of models, aren't there, that you could envisage. So it could be that we ask providers to give us a self-assessment against the consumer standards, and one of the things we test at inspection is, well, how did you arrive at those that self-assessment? How can you demonstrate that it's accurate, that it's real? What input did you get from your tenants in putting that together? What information did you use from them? Do we go and we could kind of test it with some tenants, in the jargon, triangulate with tenants. There are kind of ways to do this that we'll want to talk to people about, so that, again, it's a wee bit like the tenant satisfaction measures. This is not a game, and we'll also have, we'll have information ourselves. So if we get somebody, say we do it by way of a kind of annual self-assessment that you send us, and we kind of check through it and look for anything that might give us cause for concern. If we get something that just looks like you're absolutely marvelous in every sphere, and at the same time we've got tenants beating down our door, we've got the ombudsman telling us that it's a complete and utter train wreck of an organisation, whatever that organisation is. Firstly, they'll be quite high up the list for inspections, going back to one of the questions that Jenny asked us. But we might take that with a bit of a pinch of salt in terms of the annual assessment, and be out saying, okay, just show us how you got to those conclusions.
Okay, thank you, Caritas, and thank you, Fiona, for that answer. I'm just going to come back to another couple of questions that we've had in, and I think this is quite a nice one. Let's see where we get through this one. Fiona, what would be your top 3 tips in regard to landlords' messages to residents on how they can hold us to account now, immediately following the white paper publication? So top 3 tips in regard to landlords' message to residents on how they can hold us to account following the publication of the white paper?
I would say, from Tenant's point of view now, what do you know about what your landlord is doing, and are they meeting the consumer standards currently? Do you know anything about that? Do they tell you anything about that? Do they give you any information? So start with what you're getting now, and how are they demonstrating? If they are giving you that information, how are they demonstrating that it's true? I would ask them, what, assuming you don't already know, and that tells you something in itself. How do they engage with you now? What are the current arrangements? Do they have kind of scrutiny panels? Do they kind of everybody's learned loads during lockdown? Do they reach out? Do they use a range of means of communication? Do they ask your views on things? Do you inform, I don't know, the business planning cycle? Ask them questions. If you don't know, that tells you something already. Ask them questions about what they do now. And then, so it was 3 things I think I was asked, and ask them what will change as they go forward to kind of start to implement the white paper. Will you see anything different?
Okay, great, thank you. So it's hard when you get, I think of 3 top tips, the last one always goes out your mind, doesn't it? You get to 2 quite easily. I'm going to come back to John Townend, actually, because I think he's popped some questions in advance, but he's popped an intro in the chat as well, and I think it picks up on I think a few people asking. So I'm going to ask John to ask it. He's got a question around kind of the inspection regime and just the way we're going to treat local authorities and housing associations, ALMOs. So John, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you very much indeed, Jenny, and good afternoon, everybody. One of the things that I come across as an organisation that has an ALMO is that there is a difference, a complete difference in the ethos of the organisations. ALMOs historically have always been excellent at delivering the tenant voice locally within their residents. I'm not quite sure historically that has been evidenced by housing associations. Some excellent housing associations have delivered excellent resident voices. Others have not been forthcoming in that. Now, if the resident voice is going to mean anything, it is going to require all providers to have a baseline that everybody is going to be able to work from. How do you feel about that, please?
Okay, John, thank you very much. Just firstly on your point about ALMOs and good resident voice, which a lot of that was kind of one of the drivers behind, when ALMOs were set up. Unless an ALMO, is worth just clarifying this point. It's a slightly separate point, but it's worth clarifying it. Unless an ALMO is registered as an RP with us, the people we regulate are the local authority, because they remain the landlord. I'm sure the ALMO will be heavily involved in demonstrating that the local authority is meeting the consumer standards, but the people who are on the hook, if things aren't going well, is the local authority, because they should be ensuring that their ALMO is providing a good service. So it's just worth kind of clarifying that distinction. I think that I don't know whether it's a baseline, but one of the big themes. And it's a kind of quite a big strategic theme, I think, in the white paper, is resident engagement. And I think it is a fair comment that that's a much more mixed picture across the sector, between, if we're talking about housing associations, with housing associations and potentially actually with local authorities where, retained stock local authorities. So yes, there is a kind of, some people have possibly not prioritised that as much as they should have done over the past however many years, and the white paper is trying to kind of raise the bar for everybody on that. It goes back a little bit to, you don't want to be setting a baseline of telling people how to do it, but we will be wanting to kind of identify are people, the easiest thing to identify, I think, is people who are just doing nothing to try and reach out and engage their residents. It's really easy to kind of identify people in that space. Those who are doing so, but it's just not that effective, that's a wee bit harder. But that's where I think we don't do the good practice piece, but there are lots of other organisations, not least Tpas, who can kind of help with that sharing of good practice, what works, what doesn't work, and it will be different in different circumstances. And I think that's where you're trying to kind of not have everybody reinventing the wheel, learning from each other, but learning from the best. And that's part of that kind of levelling up agenda. And then how we'll test it, again, as I've said earlier, in due course, how we'll test it is by talking to residents. And not everybody, not everybody wants to be kind of engaged, or they want different ways of being engaged that suit them as individuals, their lifestyles. And there are very few silver linings from lockdown. I think one of the things that's been a real benefit is stuff like this. The number of people who can much more easily talk to each other, and kind of, the landlord can reach out to them and have that kind of more open discussion, I think has been a real benefit. So it's demonstrated that there's a range of means. You don't just, you don't all need to be sitting in a community hall on a sort of really cold night, with those who can make it and those who can't. You can do it in so many different ways. So there is a kind of, it's a good practice, both in outcomes, but also in terms of inputs, a range of inputs. John, I'm not sure I've entirely answered your question in the way you framed it, but I'm keen to sort of say it's not a baseline per se, it's a, learning and sharing good practice and a range of ways of engagement that work.
It's probably a failure on my part, Fiona, to explain it to you properly. Housing associations are a completely different beast. They're now encouraging development arms, which will require strong governance from the business side. And what I'm basically worried about is that residents' voices will be diluted in the corridors where it really matters. And that's what I'm bothered about with housing associations.
Yeah. So John, that's actually a much easier question to answer. I think if any housing association has missed the point and the importance of the white paper, I mean, I've no idea how they would have to be absolutely asleep. But it's a big part of our job, I think, to kind of, and we've been putting already a lot of effort into this, to kind of keep reinforcing. This is about, making sure that my line on this, and I've worked for a housing association and I've worked in development. My line on this is housing associations in particular, unlike local authorities, exist for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to house people in need in good quality accommodation and provide them good services. You do want to be doing more of it. I think development, we're not kind of against. This isn't just about existing tenants. It's about new homes for future tenants. There's a huge housing crisis in this country. People need good quality, affordable accommodation, but you're doing that to serve your core purpose of providing that good quality accommodation to people who can't otherwise access it. So they're not, and nor should they be seen as, you can do one or you can do the other. Residents are right at the heart of what you're doing as a business. Tenants are right at the heart of what you're doing as a business. That's what housing associations exist for. There's nothing else. I mean, that might be overly simplistic, but I think it's true.
I think we could have a long debate on that, but that's for another time.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. Thank you, John. Thank you for that. Okay, we're going to slight change of tack a little bit, but I've got a question in the chat box from Raj, so I'm going to come to Raj to ask your question.
Hi, Jenny. Thank you. Raj, live on Channel 5 here, PA Housing. So, hi, Fiona. Lovely to see you. I just want to go back to what you were talking about earlier, and I believe it's around chapter 5 in the white paper, and it's all about having the residents' voice. So having the residents' voice heard from those unseen and unheard groups that aren't the usual crowd, if you get my drift, of involved residents. How would you go about dealing with that then, and communicating with those more diverse communities? So things such as different language barriers, but not just a language barrier. There's multiple language barriers. There's also different kinds of mental health issues that are out there at the moment. But people with learning disabilities. How would you, as the regulator, or how would we, as the housing world, be more in touch and get those voices heard? So it's kind of like having, a bit more of a grassroots approach of things. And that's me. I'm all about getting down and dirty with the grassroots. I love getting the juicy bits from the ground, and actually it's all about that, isn't it? And actually feeding that information from there, because that is the voice of our communities, and making sure that those voices are heard up above as well. So how would you tackle that? How would you deal with that?
Okay, Raj, it will not surprise you to hear that, if I had the answer to that just like that, my life would be so much easier. It's an absolutely brilliant question, and I'd be really interested in any kind of suggestions for answers. So I think that using actually specialist organisations, working through the organisations themselves, what if it's a particular type of provider with a specialist client group, making sure that we're definitely reaching out to them.
Yeah.
And if nothing else, they'll be able to give us some insight, I think, to their tenants and their tenant base. And sometimes very vulnerable households, it's just, it's very difficult, I think, for them to articulate and engage. But hopefully, particularly if it's a good landlord, the landlord, we won't be able to do all of this directly ourselves. It's really diverse, and we just won't be resourced to do that. So going through specialist landlords, and we have lots of forums where we talk to people, that would be point one. If there are any kind of umbrella groups, actually I got Mind,
Yeah.
and they've done it a few times now. I got Mind to come in and do some training for us with what we do now on the consumer side, which is just the reactive. Because I was really conscious that an awful lot of the tenants who were engaging with us, clearly quite vulnerable, had a range of issues that they were dealing with and grappling with. And I think it really matters to try and adapt, not necessarily the substance of what you're doing, but the approach to how you're doing it, to kind of recognise that kind of difference. So I got Mind to come in and we've done it a few times now, to do some training with us about how best to try and understand and engage and be, I hope you would be naturally empathetic in any event, but there are things that there are a combination of techniques, bits of knowledge, and stuff like that we will do. None of that is a kind of here's an answer, because I don't have one, but I understand the point. And we won't be, I'm not going to pretend for 1 second we're not doing we're not in the space. This is a different change in consumer regulation terms to where it was under the TSA, where they had the pink camper van and they had the kind of national conversation and they were driving up and down the country. Yeah. That's not what we've been tasked with doing. And I'd want to be really honest about that. So we're not going to be out there talking to every single individual tenant and all different kinds of client groups, but there are sets of voices that you do want to ensure aren't being left behind. So through the landlords in the first instance, any specialist organisations that can help us with that, definitely. Other suggestions, very open to them. And, you know, if you want to talk to me about that, I'm happy to do so.
Absolutely. Thank you, Fiona. And you know, I absolutely agree. I think just going back to the green paper, and firstly, I'd like to invite you round for tea, socially distanced, of course. Just me and you, Fiona, we'll be fine. Now, I'll bring the cake. Now, I was just wondering.
I'll be there. I love cake.
Bless you. Because I know that when we did the green paper, from a PA perspective, we had an entire working group that was very diverse and actually from such different walks of life and cultural backgrounds and beliefs and everything like that. So, but I know that within the white paper, the stigma part of the green paper hasn't really been, how can I put this? Hasn't really been embraced as much as it was within the green paper, if that makes sense. And actually, the stigma with regards to social housing was one of the biggest conversation starters for us within our organisation. And sorry, I know I'm digressing, but actually I think it works part and parcel with having that resident's voice and actually having that stigma attached to it, that actually all involved residents are, you know, 800 years old and it's the same people, but actually it's not. It's trying to be more inclusive and transparent in our approach. But yes, absolutely. Thank you, Fiona.
And Jenny, if I may, can I just come back on that a little bit? Is it okay if I kind of
You do, yeah, please do.
So Reg, I mean, again, you know, really good points, and various people have kind of, you know, alluded to the fact that the stigma chapter didn't translate from the green paper to the white paper. I'm sure in many ways I am being hopelessly naive about this. But I do think, and the chapter that talks about consumer regulation is headed respect. I do think if landlords, social landlords, and us as regulator, you know, anybody involved in any of this, if you come from a starting point of respect and respect for tenants and residents, an awful lot of the other things that are covered by the white paper, you'll get that right if your starting point is that you respect your tenants and residents. And I do recognise that this is hopelessly naive. I was frankly utterly shocked that some of the kind of feedback from the round tables, and indeed, you know, we've spoken to people from Grenfell United and things. I was utterly shocked to hear that, you know, the social housing sector and social housing landlords didn't treat their tenants with respect, because that's kind of what you're there for. So I kind of, I think that if you can get it to the point where, you know, the sector generally, individual landlords have at their heart that you treat your tenants with respect, and you think about how you train your staff, and even if they're being put under pressure, because sometimes it's difficult, and you all recognise that, you treat your tenants with respect, you will go a very long way to addressing stigma. And stigma, you know, stigma from the sector is just unforgivable in my view. And then the green paper talked a little bit about stigma from politicians, and recognise that sometimes that happens. I think it's quite useful to remember that the green paper said that from time to time. And in an ideal world, you'd get to the point where the sorts of things that you see from time to time in the media, and the kind of, you know, the worst example was the kind of Benefit Street stuff, which, you know, everybody was utterly horrified by. We should be in a position, we should be able to get to a position, I hope, where stigmatizing someone because of the tenure of the home that they live in is as unacceptable as, you know, racism or, you know, homophobia or sexism, or, you know, it should just become societally unacceptable. Now, that is, it's both naive and overly optimistic. I'm an optimist by nature, and I've got, my deputy keeps telling me that is the worst qualification for a regulator, an optimist. I think we just need to balance each other out a wee bit. But you know, I do think it is, you know, respect should be at the heart of what landlords are doing. Apologies, that was a really long answer. I'm really sorry, but I kind of feel quite
Fiona,
stuck.
so you have got all the time in the world, don't you worry.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
I'm going to move us on. I've got a question that came up quite early from Wendy Foster, and I'm going to come back to Wendy because I think we've partly answered some of it, but I think there's probably a little bit more to answer. So Wendy, do you want to ask your question to Fiona if you want to come off mute?
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. I suppose my question was partly about the criteria that you're going to apply to assess something that can be quite nuanced, like tenant engagement. But I think you've answered that a bit when you talked about outcomes. So really, I'm thinking about how the really good work happens once standards have been met, and what you said about shining a spotlight on standards and how we might all rally to meet those standards. And it's the link between how standards are going to be assessed and then the league tables, because they're the thing that's going to be published, and they're going to be the thing that people will look at first and make judgments around. So my question is about the link between the assessments, and that being quite nuanced, and then the publication of the league tables.
Okay. So Wendy, thank you. Something else that changed between the green paper and the white paper was the use of the word league tables. It's not in the white paper. And that's because following publication of the green paper, I think one of the strongest bits of feedback that ministers and the department heard was, if you want to address stigma, putting your landlord in a league table and being a tenant of a landlord that's at the bottom of a league table is a really bad place to start. So we won't, we'll publish, or we'll, one way or another, we'll publish whatever set of tenant satisfaction measures, KPIs, we alight on. But we will not be publishing league tables. We'll publish them in whatever order, alphabetical, whatever it is. And if you've got a range of measures, and we do this already on value for money, it should be reasonably hard to kind of construct a single league table that says, X providers at the bottom, Y providers at the top. So we won't be publishing anything that either uses the word league tables or is a league table, which isn't to say that you won't get people like Inside Housing or somebody else will try and, it always is a good story. Somebody else will try and turn it into a league table. I'm tempted to say we'll do it in PDF form, so they'll have to really work hard to do that rather than giving them an Excel spreadsheet that they can, sort for themselves. The thing for us, and we will hold to this, is that it's our assessment of what any measures are telling us will have to be nuanced, as I hope it is now on value for money and some of the other measures that we kind of ask people to report on. And that's about understanding the business, and there can be, very clear reasons why. Ostensibly, it looks like the results are different, but it might be, there might be something that sits behind that. So I don't know. We know, for example, that routinely younger people are less satisfied. If you're just looking at customer satisfaction, younger people tend to be less satisfied than older people. So that'll talk to your tenant base. I think people in metropolitan areas tend to be less satisfied than people in kind of rural areas. There are things like that we'd at least want to take account of. You can't turn it into an excuse if you're, if it's still a rubbish service. That's what we're trying to get to the heart of. So again, Wendy, I'm not sure I've answered your question entirely, but other than to say absolutely categorically, we won't publish it as a league table. Others might turn it into one.
Thank you, Fiona. That's really
okay. Thank you.
Helpful. Yeah, cheers. Thank you for that, Wendy. I'm going to take a couple of questions that come into just direct to me. So a couple of quick ones just for Fiona, and I'll come back to the chat. Just to be aware, in the chat, people are not only posting questions there, they're posting sort of comments to what people have said and ideas and helpful things. So I know Karen Chambers has posted there about the CIH report around stigma. Nigel's posted some comments about reaching diverse views. So please do have a look in there for some help between yourselves as well of chatting. Emma from Plus Days posted stuff in around the national tenant body, so please do have a look at those. So a couple of questions, Fiona, directly into me. So what's your view on the responsible person for consumer regulation in terms of the seniority of that role, who they need to be, what qualities they're looking for? So any comments you might have on that responsible person for consumer regulation?
Sure. So I think just by way of what I think the responsible person is intended to achieve, and then I'll come on to seniority. So I think the responsible person is meant to be two things. I think they should be the person in the organisation, not that tenants go to first, but focusing on that, the primary relationship is between the landlord and the tenant, and the landlord should be getting things right. I think the responsible person is someone that tenants should be able to go to if they're just not getting any, if they're being ignored, they're not being listened to, things aren't being put right. There should be a kind of, an internal escalation route if necessary. And ideally, that person's role will be to make sure that they're, as an organisation, they are kind of doing everything they can to meet the standards, to provide good services, so that their life is kind of not spent being the direct conduit for individual tenants. So I think that's one of the things it's intended to do, is kind of a named person for tenants to think about. And then I think the other thing, and the key thing, one of the key things would be somebody that we can go to if we've got queries, or we think this isn't right. Who's got that kind of overall accountability, and I was about to say responsibility. If it's just the responsibility of one person, that's a failure, but they're accountable and they can speak on behalf of the organisation. And if that's what they're doing, and they're doing it on behalf of the organisation, they have to have credibility. They have to be able to kind of knock heads together across the whole of the organisation. You would imagine that would be someone, reasonably senior. Seniority shouldn't be everything. Credibility, and actually a bit of kind of, this is jargon, but agency. Someone who can say, I don't really care, even if you're more senior than me, you're not doing it right, you need to get this fixed. They need to be empowered by their organisation to be able to knock heads together if necessary. That might imply a level of seniority, but certainly empowerment.
That's really helpful. I think that's I know that's been tasking a lot of people in that kind of question. I am gonna ask you the follow up then. Any thoughts you'd willing to share about who that could be in a local authority? Because again, there's a lot of debate going on. Is that a councillor? Is that a member of staff? Who could it be? So if you've got any thoughts on that, you could share.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's almost any of the above. The advantages of it being a councillor is they can, if they're not doing a good job, you can vote with your votes. You can kind of make that clear with your votes at any election time. On the other hand, there are always slightly risks of short-termism, if you think you might be, not there for the duration, and you might have an awful lot else to kind of focus on. But going back to, if it's an officer, and again, this is back to, is it seniority or is it empowerment? You have to think about those things. I could imagine a situation where it is an officer, whether it's director of housing, if it's a local authority that has that kind of setup. It genuinely has to be someone that's empowered and that we would go to, in the first instance, if it looked like things were going wrong. I mean, Jenny, somebody asked me a slightly different version of this question a long time ago, actually, before the white paper was published, about, who would I go to now if things were going wrong in a local authority? We don't have a named person regime, because arrangements are different in different local authorities, and, they might not be. And my answer was, the people we write to now, if things are going wrong, are the leader and the chief exec of the council. And it was kind of couched in, and I'm sure this wasn't intended, but it was kind of couched in a sort of implication that, well, you might go to the wrong person, they're not responsible. And most of what we find non-compliance on at the minute, given our current remit, is around the home standard and particularly health and safety. And, you know, the answer to that is I don't really care who's responsible. You know, if there's a real issue, it's collective responsibility of the council. Of course, you have to sort it out. And I can't imagine a scenario where even if we've gone to slightly the wrong person, you wouldn't want to sort it out. You know, if it's about health and safety and, you know, protecting residents. And so I think there's a little bit of don't let this be a red herring. It's the empowerment that matters.
Brilliant. That's, again, very, very helpful. One more quick from a kind of anonymous, then I'm coming back to the chat for some of the ones in there. Very quickly, as a regulator, what behaviour from the sector really frustrates you? Can you give us a kind of, what don't you want to see in this new regime? So if you can answer that one, Fiona, what frustrates you as a regulator, and I suppose what we should all not be doing?
Oh God, what frustrates me? So I think this is not sector-wide, but one of the things that we often come across when things have gone wrong from some providers is that initial sort of denial. You know, they don't get it and they won't work with us. You know, I mentioned our investigation and enforcement team a bit earlier, and Jenny, I don't know if you know Harold Brown, who heads that up, but you know, if Harold comes to see you, you're in trouble. And Harold's ability to kind of get people past the denial stage pretty quickly and recognise that there's a serious problem, you know, it's a sight to behold, quite frankly. So the kind of denial and refusal to work with us is frustrating, but for the most part, normally doesn't last very long. And the outcomes will usually be, you know, quite a bit worse in regulatory terms if you're not willing to recognise that there's an issue and work with us to put it right. So possibly that in kind of, you know, the more extreme terms of things going wrong. You know, I don't know, maybe more sort of mundane day-to-day frustrations. Actually, probably quite a big one is the you still got quite a lot of organisations in the sort of territory of tell us what to do and how to do it. And, you know, it's not our role to run your organisations for you. It's your role to run them. And we're just hopefully the backstop that's, you know, gets involved if it's not quite working out. But you were not here to do it for you. That's frustrating. Give us the answer.
Okay, that's great. Top tips from everybody there, I thought, with that question. You can take that back to anybody that you need to relay that back to straight from Fiona. I'm going to come to Adrian now. I'm conscious I've not got to all the questions in the chat yet, so I'm trying to juggle. So I'm going to come to Adrian Foster, I think. You put one in earlier on. So Adrian, if you want to unmute.
Thanks, Jenny. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, my question was around the sort of number of standards and accreditations that are out there currently. So things like the tenant charter within the Together with Tenants and more widely the standards within that, but also things like the accreditation available from Tpas for excellence in engagement. And what's kind of the value of achieving those and demonstrating those with regards the regulatory assessments, both sort of the annual assessment that we do, but also obviously any assessments that you carry out yourselves. So it's just exploring the link really between those.
Sure. Adrian, that's a really good question. I hope I've been really clear. What we are interested in is, you know, and the only thing we can regulate against is, are you meeting our standards? And you know, we're not prescriptive about how. So the things that you've talked about, Tpas accreditation, Together with Tenants, those might be not prescriptive, but a bit more kind of descriptive of how you could do things. They're a means to an end. We wouldn't say you have to do those things, but they could be useful in demonstrating kind of thoughtfulness, trying to learn from good practices, as we were talking about earlier, that others have kind of put together, not reinventing the wheel. They're kind of, that alone wouldn't get you the tick in the box. It's back to the outcomes and do you meet our standards? But they can be a useful way of demonstrating that you're taking this seriously, that you're kind of, you're looking for help, assistance, support, ways that might inform how you approach meeting the standards.
Okay, thank you. Just because I'm conscious of time, and Fiona, are you okay to run on just a little bit longer?
I'm fine till 1:30, Jenny.
Yeah, perfect. Great. We'll just take two or three more then, just to try and get through them. I'm going to take two together. It's one from James and one from Robin. I'm going to merge them into two questions. So what importance do you place, or do you view tenant assurance scrutiny in the overall governance? So what prominence do you place on scrutiny? And also, what's your view of tenants on boards? So if we take those two questions together.
Yeah, they are they're definitely related questions. I don't, again, this goes back to, I do apologise if this sounds like there's sort of slightly kind of wishy-washy answers. What we're looking for is, whatever means that are effective and that work, that allow tenants to hold their landlord to account. And that is the third pillar, actually, of the sort of co-regulatory settlement. It's not just between the regulator and the landlord, it's tenants themselves as well. So a tenant scrutiny panel, fantastic, but if they're not being allowed to scrutinise the right things, or they're not being listened to, or it's kind of having no impact, well, it's just a name, isn't it? So again, it's back to is it effective? That's one means, there might be others. It's about what works best for your organisation, and actually for your, most importantly, for your tenants. So great. And exactly the same answer, I think, about tenants on boards. That might be a great way to listen to your tenant's voice, but it's been used in the past as a kind of one-size-fits-all approach. And I think slightly discredited as a one-size-fits-all. It could work really fantastically well. It can put an awful lot of kind of heavy lifting on that one individual tenant. And they're a board member as well as the tenant representative often, so they need to be able to fulfil maybe a slightly wider range if you want them to be a board member rather than just the tenant rep. And again, there's if you do that, do you not need to do anything else? You've ticked the box, job done. So I think all of this comes back to the most effective means of holding landlords to account. And I think these depend on the size and scale of landlord. There can be multiple ways to do that. You don't just want to do one. And it's back to the outcomes rather than just the inputs and just the structures.
Great. Thank you, Fiona, for answering those two together. Okay, I'm going to come to one from Tim. We haven't talked really about complaints, so I'm going to come back to one that I missed earlier. How far can the regulator go concerning the new complaints process and complaint orders? As it is now a governance issue, can the regulator change a governance rating based on a complaints order? So, I mean, there's some specifics in that, but I think generally the relationship between yourself and the ombudsman could cover that.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, we work and have done for a long time, actually, pretty closely with the ombudsman. But we have different roles, and it's really important to kind of emphasise that. And I think they are bits of a jigsaw. And you need to understand, and I think in theory that jigsaw fits together really well. You need to make sure it works together in practice. So, the ombudsman coming up with a complaint order wouldn't, and in my view shouldn't, automatically lead to a kind of governance, a change of our view on governance, because it can be what the ombudsman's looking at for the most part is sort of those individual complaints, and things can go wrong and people can get things wrong, but it's at that kind of slightly more individual level. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's an organisational wide issue. And that's what we're testing. Is there kind of evidence that at organisational level, something's just going wrong across the board in terms of governance of the organisation? So it wouldn't be automatic. And, if it were, you don't need two organisations. We are doing two slightly different things. They fit together, but they're slightly different things. If it was just a kind of automatic, you wouldn't necessarily need two sets of organisations to do that, because it's just a kind of one does one thing and the other one just goes, okay, automatic change. But it would be something that we would take account of in any a kind of engagement that we were having, again, back to the, informing the inspections, informing our view on whether or not people were meeting the standards, and going back to Creta's question earlier, if you gave us an annual assessment that said everything was absolutely wonderful and you were getting, I don't know, repeat complaint orders, that would cause us to question it. We would certainly want to kind of understand it in inspections. And actually, we talk to the Ombudsman all the time. So, we'd want to be testing with them, in those conversations. Is there anything that is on your radar that is moving much more up into that organisational level of concern that you think we should be having a bit of a look at?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, great. That's a great answer. And nice debate going on in the chat, I can see, about scrutiny and everything. So please contribute to that. We will capture that chat as well and use that in the future. Can I just perhaps clear one up that kind of got brought us on the session I was on this morning as well, Fiona, about the sort of financial measures. So particularly the one about chief exec pay always grabs the attention of everybody, doesn't it? That's going to be published. Can you just clarify kind of your role in that in going forward in the future, and any comments on that? Because I think most people are saying that's fine, but it's not the whole picture, is it? And just any dangers or anything you want us to be alert to about that?
Yeah. So there's quite a lot of people on this call. What I think. That ended up in the white paper quite late in the day, the one thing I would say is politicians, from time to time, but very regularly, get quite exercised about chief executive pay and show quite a big interest in it. So it's something that they come back to regularly. It got put in at the last minute. The white paper is very clear that is not something that that will come under the regulator's standards. So you can read into that what you want. I think there is, there is a bit of a read across to our value for money standard, and providers making best use of the resources available to them. So if people are we do from time to time, we have from time to time downgraded people in governance terms, on particularly payoffs, actually excessive payoffs, and kind of going outside contractual terms and conditions. And we might have views about pay, but it's not for us to set pay or get involved in that, because you end up marking your own homework. You could just imagine scenarios where we're saying, X has been paid too much, and the market changes and you can't get good leaders or whatever it happens to be. So it's not an accident that bit of the measures we are not don't come under us and our consumer regulation rule.
Great. No, it's useful to clarify that, I think, for everybody. And you touched on some of this already, I know, but if we can just perhaps just a recap on, I think what a lot of tenants are asking around is about teeth. So people understanding your teeth as a regulator. So people not complying, just kind of remind us again of some of the measures that you would take, that you would implement to bring people back into compliance.
Yeah, sure. So I continue to be surprised, because I've not been doing this job forever, unlike some of my colleagues. I continue to be surprised by the kind of value of kind of just regulatory downgrades and how seriously people take those. And as I said earlier, once the limited number who kind of get over their denial phase will work with us to put things right. So quite often just a downgrade or a notice, that for the most part, that's enough to do it. However, in the cases where it's not enough to do it, our toolkit is quite extensive. We rarely use the full amount, but we can do things like, and we've done a bit more of this recently, you might be aware, we can appoint non-executives to the board of the provider to try and strengthen the governance. We can levy fines. We never have so far, but one of the things that the white paper signals is giving us unlimited fine levying powers. For charitable organisations or local authorities, where it kind of comes out of the money that would otherwise be reinvested in the business, we would think very carefully on that. But it might be useful as a tool with the for-profit providers if it is really going to hurt them in their pocket. In extremis, we can, quite a lot of providers, this is without us actually, using any of our formal enforcement powers, but when things go wrong, you'll see, particularly from our kind of previous publications, and I'm hoping we might have another one soon, quite a lot of providers don't survive as independent standalone entities. They end up being taken over by others. I've lost count of the number of chief execs who've lost their job when we have to get involved because things have gone wrong. The board changes, the chair step, lots of things flow from what we do without us having to explicitly make those things happen. So there can be some really big consequences for either individuals or for their organisations. But in terms of our actual enforcement powers, we can appoint people, we can appoint managers. Sometimes we have to go through a statutory inquiry first. In extremis, we can direct people after an inquiry to transfer their stock to someone else. We do have quite dramatic powers. The mere fact that they exist means that we pretty much never need to use them because we can get people back into compliance without doing that.
Not to end on a negative-ish note like that, though. So we're gonna end on a positive. And I know I haven't got to everybody's questions. I think I've covered most that were in the chat and that submitted in advance. I think I've got everybody managed to ask at least one of their questions. But I suppose just really to sum up, and I think you're just trying to take us back in the arc from where this all started, really, which is Grenfell. So just for you to give your thoughts, really, of do you think even today, now, given what we've got, the sector is hearing and doing enough to make sure that we're doing everything we can to prevent another Grenfell happening? What's your sense of where we're at as a sector and how we're moving forward in tenant voice and safety primarily?
Yeah, so Jenny, I think that's a really good question to finish with. I think the sector is and absolutely gets the seriousness of the building safety issues that Grenfell has highlighted, and the importance of keeping tenants safe. And I've lost count of the number of chief executives who tell me that they go to sleep at night, if they go to sleep at all, really worried about this and kind of waking up in the morning and it happening in their stock. And frankly, it's not just chief executives of providers that worry about that, as do residents, so do we. So I think, yes, they get it. I think, yes, probably doing everything they can, but it is not, there's not a silver bullet. There's not a kind of easy, you can just fix it like that answer. We've seen the complexity. Some of the things that have come out in the inquiry about, the cladding specialists and the kind of, insulation specialists not telling the truth about the flammability of their products, and the kind of, end-to-end industry-wide issues that this has thrown up. I've just been utterly chilling. And I think what that means is it is, you know, it will take time to kind of fix all of this. It will take time, it's complicated, it takes resource, it takes lots of people resources, you know, finding enough specialists to be able to do this at any kind of pace has proved to be really tricky. And that's why people are spending so much money on wake and watches and all the rest until you can be surer that you've made your buildings safe again. So I think it is taken incredibly seriously, which is not to say there's a cast iron guarantee that it's all fixed at the minute.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry,
Plenty of work still to do.
Yeah, that's not a terribly cheery answer to give, but anything else would be just misleading.
Yeah, I think that what we've got now is kind of so many more things, though, haven't we, that are coming together. The merging of these things that are coming together around the building safety regulator yourselves, improved role on the ombudsman. All of these things are playing a part in creating, hopefully, a safer environment. Fiona, I just want to say, on behalf of everybody I'm sure here today, a huge thank you for taking the time and going over a little bit on Q&A as well. And that was really good. We had so many come in. A really big thank you for taking the time to do that and answer some. And I think we all learned plenty of new things there today. I know I certainly did. Please do keep your questions coming in. If there's any other questions you want us to put to Fiona after this, I'm sure we can fire them over and get them to Fiona and her team. Just to say thank you to you all. Thank you, Fiona, and stay safe, everybody, and see you all very, very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye. Bye.